In 2015, at the age of 23, I had what I consider still today to be one of the single most profoundly intense and equally terrifying experiences of my life. I'd returned to Belfast after having been in work in London for a few days, and I decided that the next morning I'd make the journey back home. So I got up, I made the way to the train station, and I got on a train in Belfast and got off in Ballymoney. And no, being in Ballymoney is neither the terrifying nor the intense part of this story. But my brother was waiting for me, and I got in the car and we made the drive back to the family home, where my mum and dad were surprised to see me. I hadn't told them that I would be there. And the moment that followed probably only lasted for a few minutes, but at the time it felt like hours were passing. And in that moment, I told my parents something that had been consuming me. In that moment, I told my parents that I was gay. Now, I was met by a response of nothing but unconditional love and acceptance. And to this day, it was the greatest sense of relief I've ever experienced. It felt like a physical weight being lifted from my shoulders. And I remain conscious of two things. The first, that not everyone is as lucky as I am from the response that they get from their loved ones when they come out. And the second, that up until that point, and even in moments since, I've led an existence of variations of me. And it's funny, because despite knowing, really knowing, in my head and in my heart, that my family loved me, and that of course they would accept me for who I am, it was the world around me that had told me to expect a very different response. LGBT people are conditioned to expect the worst, while holding on to a little bit of hope for the best. When we think about the experiences of LGBT people, I now work for Europe's largest LGBT rights organisation, and I often joke that that allows me to say that I'm a professional homosexual now. That doesn't mean they're amateurs, it just means I'm better at it. But the reality is that in every new interaction, with every new job or every new boss, with every new colleague, in every new social situation, or in every new introduction to a friend of a friend, LGBT people make decisions. We make conscious, pragmatic decisions about who knows what. We make split-second assessments about what we disclose. And I'm not talking about anything particularly intricate. I'm talking about things that are everyday interactions for other people. If I get into a taxi and the driver asks, "What are you getting up to this weekend?" Do I say I'm going for dinner with my boyfriend? If I do I say boyfriend or partner? If I say partner, is that as obvious as saying boyfriend? So if I choose not to say anything at all, what do I have to make up instead? You might be surprised by how often we go through these things in our head and in our life because the world around us has told us to expect the worst. But when I came out, that sense of relief was one of the single most empowering feelings I've ever experienced. And so I want you to imagine, if the choices that we face on a daily basis range from being entirely open and honest and the vulnerability that comes with that, to offering a redacted or edited version of ourselves, to withholding our truth entirely, are any of those things more or less authentic than each other? Probably. But I want you to imagine what it must be like to be faced with those choices every single day for an individual. I want you to imagine what it must feel like to be faced with those choices every day, of every week, of every month, of every year, for an entire community of people. Earlier this year, the UK government published the findings of the first ever national LGBT survey. Spoiler alert, it was pretty grim reading. Around a quarter of all LGBT people have accessed some kind of mental health support service over the course of the last year. 40% have experienced an incident of something like either verbal harassment or physical violence in that same period. Over 2/3 have said that they have avoided holding the hand of their same-sex partner for fear of the response that they will receive. That is still our lived reality today. But what can you do other than continuing to be decent human beings? Well, I want to tell you another story. And it might seem a bit odd, but there's a point to it, I promise. And I want to take you back to November 3rd, 2008, the night before the US presidential election. The then soon-to-be president, Barack Obama, was addressing his final rally before votes would be cast the following morning. And to the crowd gathered in front of him in Virginia, he recounted a story of an experience he'd had at a much earlier stage of his campaign. He talked about getting in his car with his staff really early one morning in the pouring rain to make a trip to an isolated part of South Carolina. He was in a bad mood. They arrived. It was an hour and a half away from anywhere else. And when they arrived at the venue and opened the doors, lo and behold, there was about 20 people there to greet him, a small crowd. But Obama's a professional. He smiled, he shook hands, he made his way around the room. And as he was doing that, he heard a voice from behind him. "Fired up," the voice said. "Ready to go," it continued. And Obama turned around, confused, of course, and saw that the origin of this voice was a small, slightly older lady wearing what he called a big church hat. And Obama looked at her, and she looked at him, and she smiled and continued. "Fired up," she said to the room. "Ready to go," she continued. And to his surprise, the room responded to her. At this point, he looked at his staff, and his staff looked at him, and they all shrugged their shoulders because they had no idea what was going on. But as this continued, "Fired up," the crowd responded. "Ready to go," they responded again. Obama admitted he was starting to feel fired up. By the end, as this went on for a few minutes, his mood had gone, and he felt ready to go. And the point of that story, for anyone who follows US politics, you'll know that that had an influence in how Obama engages with his crowds, with his rallies, and he learned lessons to keep in his toolbox for further campaigns. But there's another point to that story, because at that rally the night before the election, he told the crowd in Virginia that woman taught him something. That little woman with the big church hat taught him that there's power in one voice. That if one voice can change a room, then one voice can also change a city. And he said if one voice could change a city, it could also change a state. And if one voice can change a state, it can also change a nation. And Obama believed that if one voice could change a nation, then one voice could also change the world. And so I want you to think about authenticity. And I want you to think about the scale of the challenges that we face today, both locally but also as a global community. And I want you to imagine a world where people aren't conditioned to expect the worst. Imagine a world where people don't need to be given permission to be themselves. We're not there yet. Arguably, we're quite far from being there. But what if the voices that we're not currently hearing are the ones that could help us to deal with the challenges that we face today? What if the voices that we're not currently hearing are of the people who are most impacted by the challenges that we face today? Because then we all have a responsibility. We all have a responsibility to elevate those voices. And it's fitting that we're here today, in this building, in Stormont, in the home of power sharing, because that is exactly what I want to ask of you today. When you leave, when you return to your life, I want you to take stock of the power that you hold. I want you to reflect upon the spaces that you occupy, where you have power and authority and influence. And in those spaces, I want you to make space. I want you to elevate the voices of the people that we hear from the least. Because here's my hope, that if we believe that one voice can change a room, imagine the possibility of that one voice that can also change the world. Thank you.